Welcome to the Inspirational Leaders Series, a collection of short interviews with sharp, impactful leaders because the business world needs more refreshing people like them. And my name is Teresa Brazen. I am a leadership and executive coach for design leaders and design leadership teams, and I help them to maximize their impact and elevate the stature of design inside of their organizations. And today I have a very special guest by the name of Greg Petroff. He is someone who has over 25 years of experience in the design world and an extensive track record in leading teams that deliver user-centric, context-driven, creative products and services that enhance the efficiency of organizations and enterprises. And his mission is to bring design to the forefront of organizational communication, culture, and strategy, and to empower users with seamless, intuitive, and engaging solutions that solve their problems. And he also thinks of himself as an Ifnographer and a possibilitarian. Thank you so much for joining me, Greg.
Thanks, Teresa. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I have to ask you about Ifnographer and possibilitarian.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Tell me more about that as a starting point.
So I'm an architect by background. I have 2 degrees in architecture. I started my career as an architect, and then I drifted into sort of digital and software, et cetera. And we have a whole bunch of friends from our college era that can never figure out what I do. And I was sitting in a ski cabin up in Tahoe with a bunch of my architecture friends, and one of them said, "I know what you are. You're an Ifnographer." And I said, "Well, what is that?" And he goes, "You're that guy who figures out what if." And it really stuck with me because I think a lot of what we do in design is, discern what a possible future could be. And so that was sort of the starting point of that piece. And then a possibilitarian is, I've always been about the art of the possible. And I'm always very optimistic that we can solve problems even with the constraints that we may have, that there's always a way that you can juxtapose or combine or put things together and, improve the situation. And so I don't exactly know where that term came up. You can see it more often now, but Dave Gray and I, who's a good friend of mine, have been talking about possibilitarianism for a long time, and it's really about just having a positive outlook from a problem-solving perspective.
Yeah, it's possibilitarian, by the way, if anybody is wondering, is not actually a word. I love
No,
made
it's
up words.
apparently, if you go on LinkedIn, there are hundreds of people who use that in their description of who they are. So yeah,
so it's a made up word that should be a word.
Yes.
Basically. Well, okay.
The actual term is possibilitist or something like that. But
okay.
I like possibilitarian better.
Yeah. And I mean, so it sounds like part of your ethos as a human and as a leader is, I love what you call it, the art of the possible, and just you're probably more of a glass half full kind of person.
Always, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take that a step further, because I think we're starting to get into, your makeup as a design leader. And I'm curious, if you were, let's say you were going to write a book about your leadership approach, and you're going to have different chapters of that book that highlight different things that are important to you, that feel like, they're foundational to your philosophy about leadership. What chapters would you put in that book?
That's a great question. I think, designers do well with clarity. And, as much as we say we love ambiguity and that we can surf ambiguity, I'm very comfortable with ambiguity. To do good work, you need to have the box defined. And then you can always go outside the box, inside the box, but you need to have the box. Otherwise, you spend too much time moving around trying to figure out where you are. And so I think one of the key things a leader can do is to drive clarity in the organizations that they work in. And we find today often that design leaders are actually, spending a lot of time with their product colleagues to drive more clarity out of roadmaps so that they can then give that to their teams so that they can be more effective. So definitely be a chapter on clarity. I think there's a chapter on being kind to yourself, right? I think
Mm.
as you move up in leadership, it can get lonely at times. That there's not everything you can share with your own team, and your cross-functional peers may not actually understand all the things that you need to be taking into account because they have different backgrounds and different roles and jobs. And then I would definitely write something about over communication. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that's interesting about design teams is that they need to feel safe and they need to feel connected to purpose to be able to perform well. And if you don't have those conditions set up, they can get distracted. And I actually gave a talk, it was maybe 10 years ago, on and the premise of it was designers are natural born conspiracy theorists. And the background behind it is kind of makes sense a little bit because we're empaths. If we work in large organizations, if there's change going on in the leadership level, we see it before it gets announced. We can see it because leaders will believe that they're not behaving differently, but they are because they know something about the future state. And because we're creatives, we can imagine what it means in the absence of information. So, and because we're human, we usually figure out like the worst case, and then all of a sudden we're distracted and we're not focused on work, and you have water cooler conversations, etc.
Mhm.
And so, with design teams, you cannot avoid change in large organizations. It's something that happens all the time. When I was at GE, it happened like every 8 months. But what you can do is say, let's focus on the work. If we focus on the work and do great work, everyone's going to be fine. And so you really have to spend a lot of time with teams, giving people clarity, insight, outcome, direction, and repeat that over and over again so that folks feel like they're connected to something that's meaningful for them. And if you do that, then you get higher productivity and people feel better about the work that they're doing, and the quality of the work goes up too.
It's so interesting. I haven't heard anybody articulate it quite like that. Like this particular community of people, this like combination of empathy is a strong skill and like a philosophy of like that underpins how we work as designers. But there's the empathy piece and the creativity piece, and if those exist in a context where things are changing and there's not a lot of communication about it, they're going to feel what's happening, even though nobody's talking about it. And they're creatively going to come up with reasons for why it's happening, whether or not those are actually reflective of reality.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they're going to be distracted from actually doing their job. Right.
Yeah.
So you can't avoid it because it's a fact of large organizations. Change is part of the process. But you can help people feel more comfortable with it and also connect to it. Like it's just a given. Like that was the one thing, the one thing we know for sure is change is happening. It's always something that you have to address. And, sometimes it happens to the design org. Sometimes it happens to other teams. Sometimes it happens to strategy. Sometimes it happens to leaders. Like it's happened to me in my case. So I think it's just, the more transparent you can be with your teams. And part of that's also kind of recognizing how much can they carry. I've made that mistake before where I've overshared. And then people are like, oh my God, what's going on? You need to be very, very clear along the way. And that helps people stay grounded and feel like they're part of something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that so the implication from a leadership perspective is really managing the narrative.
Yeah.
Like the external and internal narrative of the team as much as you can. And interesting that like balance of oversharing and undersharing.
Yeah. And narrative is really important too. I think, we succeed when we tell good stories in the organization. And I think all of us can learn to be better storytellers. And so that's also one of the things that I might have a chapter in a book around, growing storytelling skills. When at Cisco, we built this thing called Campfire, which is all about storytelling. And brought invited guests to talk about different ways to do stories, modeled different storytelling techniques, tried to coach our teams in terms of like, hey, you're working with your cross-functional peers, tell a story, that'll help
Mhm.
you connect to the outcomes that are important to you. So
Yeah, I'm a big fan of storytelling skills. I teach a influence through storytelling class for pragmatic design. Um, and I just feel the interesting thing I think about storytelling is actually that the design community, um, I think, is really well set up to be great storytellers
mhm.
because of the empathy skill. And actually, there's a bunch of tools that we use in design that are useful in the storytelling context, like
Mhm.
research, right?
Mhm.
Using research to understand your audience and then really tailor your communication. It's the same thing as what we do in product
Mhm.
design, right?
Mhm.
Um, all those skills can be applied to storytelling too.
Mm.
Um, yeah. Well, I want to. So we talked about some chapters. There's
Mm.
clarity, communication, being really thoughtful about communication,
Mhm.
sort of your keeping a pulse on yourself as a leader.
Yeah.
I think was another sort of piece of that.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about, well, in storytelling, you
Yeah. Right.
mentioned that too. Um, I'm curious about experiences in your leadership journey that, challenges you've faced, obstacles you've run into, anything that helped to shape your perspective on how leadership should work and like why those would be some of the chapters in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, I probably made more mistakes than I've done things right sometimes, right? I think you learn from the opportunities that you have in front of you, and you try things, and some things work and some things don't. And also, every company that you work for has slightly different cultures. So what may have worked in company A may not work in company B as successfully as you'd like. I think there are a couple of things that are really important. One is understand the maturity of the organization that you're in and its ability to receive the work that you are providing. And don't make the mistake of doing design strategy if there's no partner on the other side to receive the content. And
Mhm.
I've done that in my career. I've seen other people do that where they say, oh, I'm going to add design strategy, and if we do it, then people will come and they will love it. And the reality is, if you don't have a partner on the other side that's asking for it,
Mhm.
it's it's arguably wasting company resources, even though the work's really interesting, right? So,
Mhm.
um, and that's just one example of, if you think of a maturity curve of design organizations, it's assess where you are and where you want to be, and then make steps that are practical and smart along the way, that you have owners on the other side or stakeholders on their side who are vested in the result that you're building. And it doesn't mean that you can't get to doing strategy. It just means that you have to build it's sort of, recently we did this exercise with my team where we did a climbing or mountaineering idea. And we said, look, we're trying to get to the top of the mountain. We're at base camp. What has to be at camp 2? And we can't go to camp 3 before we get to camp 2. And we had the team sort of generate the ideas of like, what are the things that we needed to have in place, and thinking you take steps to move things from base camp to camp 2, and then once camp 2 is stable, you can start thinking about getting to camp 3, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that's an important thing for us as design leaders, is to really recognize the maturity of the organization to accept the different kinds of things that design can bring to the table, and then be smart about how you build that capacity in the organization over time. You just can't, bring it ahead of time. You have to have dance partners.
Oh, I love that. Dance partners. Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is really astute. Is is to know your context,
Yeah,
right? And in a way, set your own expectations accordingly.
that's right.
Yeah.
And I think we all want to be a stage 5 design team, right? There's very few of
Mhm.
those. I've never been able to get there. I think I've gotten to stage 4 in different maturity models, like once or twice. But we aspire to do that. And, you want to be in a spot where design is part of transforming the organization and is not just doing great work, it's doing work that's changing the outcomes of the business and creating outcomes for the users that the business is serving. And doing it in a way where your cross-functional peers recognize it and go, wow, that is super valuable. Like,
Mhm.
we want more of that. And to do that, you have to build trust with your cross-functional peers. You have to take steps along the way. Storytelling is a really important part of that aspect. Being great at fit and finish and executing always is really important. So you have to make sure that the work that you do is like rock solid. But then creating space for exploration or moving to that next level is a trick. And sometimes it's very hard because you may not have the resources, or you may not have the right people, or you might not, or you have deadlines that are consuming your capacity, and you have to make, tough decisions around, okay, we're going to, maybe not work as hard on this one area because we need to start moving some things to camp two. And,
Mhm.
and I think if you do that, then, you start to build credibility in an organization, and you have the ability to sort of make change happen.
Yeah, so there's sort of it's like you're holding a certain kind of like pragmatism, but
Mhm.
also still aspiration and movement forward too.
Yeah,
Sort
100%.
of thinking about how to like move toward that, but also, I think that's your earlier point about like if you don't have the partners to receive the work
Mhm.
at a certain level, like you were talking about strategy, you could argue that it's a waste of resources. I thought that was just a really interesting
Mhm.
point. Yeah. So, Greg, tell me though, you are a particular kind of leader.
Mhm.
You, Greg, are your own unique unicorn in the
For
leadership
sure.
world. So, tell me more about like what has made you the kind of person and leader that you are.
Wow. Well, I've always gravitated towards sort of leadership roles, even when I was young. So I don't. I guess I like being in the middle of stuff and trying to help people along the way. Uh, I kind of resonate when I'm helping people grow. I really love hiring people who are much smarter than I and enabling them to be successful and placing them in positions where they can maybe take over from me, or move on to something that's better for them. So I'm a big fan of sort of servant-based leadership, which is the leader is not directing all the traffic. The leader is creating the conditions for others to be successful. And I often, and I'm not the only one who says this, but my design problem is a functioning org, and creating the conditions for the design, research, and content design, and all the other different roles that might be in a design organization, for individuals to be successful, to see their own careers grow, right? So that you have to have it's an art to be able to have an organization that allows you to mature people over time, and um, identify what's in the best interest of each of the people in your team, and at the same time recognize you're running a business and those may not be aligned, right? So
Mhm.
I've had so I don't know, I would say I'm very people centric in terms of the way that I operate. And I also believe that um, oftentimes, even when people are struggling in an organization, it may be that they're in the wrong role, or that the conditions aren't set up for them to be successful. And they don't have the skill set or self awareness to recognize how to get out of that. And so if I can coach or help people, that'll be the first step that I would try to sort of help them be more successful in the organization as a whole. So that's sort of one. Um, and then, just basically, lead with empathy. And I think to the degree that you can be vulnerable with your team and sort of explain that you are human and that, fallible as well, it helps people recognize that they can be as well. And, I want people to just become their authentic self when they come to work. And doing that sometimes requires us to be a little bit more open about our own selves along the way.
I'm just writing down what I heard is there's you're really interested in growing people
Yeah.
and creating a space where people can be themselves and where vulnerability, both on your part and other people's part, is an option.
Yeah, and I'll say one other thing. I am super interested, by the way, in doing really amazing work. So I don't want to, I think that's goes without saying, but sometimes it gets missed when you talk about the other things I'm talking about. But it's sort of my belief that you don't get amazing work if you don't create the conditions for people to be their full self at work. And to the extent that we can be as close to self-aware of who we are and help people become more self-aware, then people can leverage their strengths and feel safe in doing so. And then what happens is the quality of your outcomes gets better over time. So, it's a strategy for doing great work. And so there's definitely room also in terms of my leadership environment to create just a forum or a salon like environment for great ideas to flourish. And I certainly have lots of ideas, and I will, every once in a while kind of lean on the scales, but I try not to do that very much anymore because I want the folks that work for me to be empowered.
The phrase that's coming up for me is from the Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, if you build the right environment, great work just comes out of that. With nurturing and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think there's one thing I have learned, though. I think that that's really important. Maybe there's a chapter in the book about this too, which is you can have a high performing design organization and you can be doing great work, and your cross-functional leadership doesn't see it, understand it, or recognize it. And so you have to pay a lot of attention to what are the metrics that your cross-functional peers are measuring, and how do you explain the wins that you're having in a way where they see them as well. And that's challenging, and specifically it's challenging when you're kind of pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And maybe you're showing up with something that a product peer or an engineering peer might feel like is their territory, or that they didn't expect design to show up in a certain way. And so I think that there's that too. There's also as much as you can have the high performing team, one of the design leader's biggest jobs is to manage up. Peter Merholtz has a nice framework for how you spend your time. And most of my time is managing with my cross-functional peers or managing up, and most of my staff's time is managing down and with their cross-functional peers, and together we build kind of a bridge between the work that we're doing and the outcomes the company is expecting, and also telling the story of the impact that we're making in a way where the organization values it.
Yeah, so you can be doing great work is sort of okay, another metaphor or phrase. What was it? If a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, what is it? Is that it?
Something like that, yeah. I forget the one.
I don't know why the exact word. Anyways, does anyone hear it? It's kind of the same idea of a really important piece of the puzzle. It sounds like a big part of what you've seen as your job is making sure that the folks around the team understand the value that they're creating.
Yeah, and absolutely. And then there's one little thing that I think I've learned, the hard way too, which is at the end of the day, even if you're the leader of the organization and you have
Mhm.
super talented people underneath you and you've empowered them, and in fact, when you go to meetings, you push them out there first to talk, and you're kind of in the background, kind of orchestrating that stuff. There's some piece of your portfolio that you have to own, and you have to show up and say, like, my fingerprints are on this.
Mm.
And it's because um, engineering and product does the same thing, and they value that. They want to see you not just as a successful um, leader of your organization and delivering results. They also still want to see you as a designer. And
Mm.
and I think for many of us who get really busy or have very large organizations, that can be very hard.
Mm.
And I'm actually thinking, the next role I have, I want to have a very small team that just works for me.
Mm.
Is incubating stuff that I can bring to the table. Because I think at the end of the day, especially in large organizations, there's that visibility of, like, are you effectively delivering all the things that we need, but also is there something that the leader's bringing special sauce to the table?
Mm.
And it's not that I haven't done that in the past. I have, but I think it's um, balancing that between enabling your organization, but also just having that little slice is important.
I love it. I love the idea of you have your own special sauce team.
Yeah, yeah.
But it kind of that actually, there are a lot of people that in the design world that I've talked with that are either like want to move into more senior roles
Mm,
or are there and um, worried about being able to still be creative,
mm, mhm.
and like, am I okay with being further away from the work? And
Mhm.
that's like a big topic. We could, I
Yeah,
don't know, I want to dig into that right
yeah,
now,
yeah.
but I think it's really interesting that you're saying, and it totally makes sense that your thumbprint still matters. So,
Mhm.
strategically, like choosing a place for that thumbprint to happen and making sure you're creating time and space for yourself is important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I also think it connects to that statement you just said, which is keeping your own creative imagination flowing
Mhm.
and working. I mean, I have lots of ideas around how to help my teams be more successful, and oftentimes just the advice is the given is fun. You can sit and say, "Oh, I see the problem you're trying to solve. I've seen that problem before. Let's try that." You could try this. Um,
Mhm.
as a resolution. You don't have to. But here's an opportunity to sort of make it better. And then when you see the next iteration and you see that feedback sort of circle kind of happen, I think you can still stay, very much engaged with the work, even as a leader. So,
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, there's lots of things that leaders have to do that are also, designers don't like doing, budgets and headcount and evaluations and performance reviews, and there's a ton of administrivia that happens in organizations that are actually important,
Yeah.
but um, we're not necessarily like super enthused to do it all the time. And frankly, you need to do it well because you want the
Mhm.
help your organization be more successful.
Mhm. Well, what about what is a belief or two that you held about leadership earlier in your career that you've since changed your mind about?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not sure if this is about leadership, but this is the personal piece. I'm a very patient person, and so I'm usually willing to listen to differences of opinion or different points of view, or people coming to my desk and, asking for things that aren't 100% related to the things that I'm responsible for, or that my team's responsible for, or are going to support the final outcome that we're looking for. And I was working at GE. This is about 10 years ago, and had assembled this really awesome team, and we were very popular, and there were lots of asks for our time, and I thought at the time, I should answer everything and try to be everywhere at all the places if I could. And then I had a health issue. I had colon cancer, and I had to take a step back from that period. I gave my team to my number two. He took over, and when I came back, one of the things I learned was that your time is super valuable. And what you choose not to do is almost as important as what you choose to do. And that you have to protect your space from people who are asking things from you for all sorts of legitimate reasons, or or just because, they are who they are in the organization, and say no. And create, because that gives you the runway to do the things that you're saying yes to. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn, but I learned it because, in my recovery, my energy was so low. I really had to be ruthless about what I said yes to and what I said no to. My time was very, very valuable to me, but and my energy was only, and I worked through that whole experience, which was like a little bit crazy, but that's how I processed it. Thankfully, I'm all fine and healed up from it. But that was a major learning for me, which is, sometimes, use your time wisely. And then the last thing I think is declaring what you're not going to do is really important also. And making it clear for people that we're not doing that. And the reason behind that is, in organizations, human nature is such that, if there's an idea that someone wants to promote, they're going to do the job that you ask them to do, and they're going to do the job that this extra thing, because they believe either that's going to allow them to gain traction in the organization and be noticed and allow them to move forward, or something that they're really adamant about, or it's just the thing that they love doing. All those are great reasons for them, but they're not great reasons for the organization as a whole. And every time you have that extracurricular idea floating around in the organization, it means that someone's having a meeting about it. It creates friction in organizations. People even start competing for resources to promote those ideas. And frankly, some managers may support that for their own reasons, to either help that person move forward or help their own agenda in organization. And then what ends up happening is you start to lose your capacity to work on the things that are really important, because you've got these little extra things going on. And I think one of the things I've noticed in a lot of organizations, we don't have the courage to stand up and say, we are not doing this. And if we see people doing this, we're going to ask them to stop doing it, because it's something we're not doing right now. Now, you may not agree with that. If you don't, then that's okay. Then maybe this isn't the right place for you to park your hat. But knowing what you shouldn't be doing is really, really important.
I think this topic is super interesting to me, and I wrote a post really recently about yes culture and no culture, and how what you model as a leader, your willingness to proclaim, we're not doing this, we are doing this, or say no to your partner who's asking for a favor, can your design team do this real quick? I'm saying that's not aligned with what we're prioritizing right now, sets the tone, across the team. And I think of it as like nesting dolls, right? There was a woman that I was speaking with who shared that she had a manager that was really good at saying no. and not, not in a crappy way, just
Mhm,
like
mhm,
explaining, but was good at boundaries. And in fact, questioned her about why she was prioritizing, to your point, certain things. And like,
mhm,
it doesn't make sense for her to, be spending time on that. And she found it really liberating
mhm.
because her manager was modeling saying no, and it made it more okay for her to say no, because
Mm.
without that in the environment, I think a lot of people say yes to a lot of things,
Yeah, it's really hard, as a design
especially
leader,
in the design
yeah,
world.
in the design world,
Yeah.
and, like, one of the things that you have to do if you're gonna be successful at doing that is you have to understand your capacity, like, really well.
Mhm.
And, that's something I learned that, you should have, an Airtable or some tool, that shows the work that your teams are doing, down to the week. And then if a leader comes to you and says, "Hey, we need you to do this," you can say, "That's awesome. What do we take off the list?"
Yeah.
Because we're at capacity, right? If we're not at capacity, great, we can take that on. That's a really interesting idea. But without that, you don't have the bargaining power within the organization to be able to say. You just end up having to say yes to things from senior leadership. And sometimes senior leadership is asking you to do something because they know something, they see something that they can't articulate well, but they're right, and you have to just kind of go with it and say, okay, we'll figure it out. But then you still have to go all the way through your organization and say, okay, we're not asking people to do more than they're already doing. We have to work smarter, and we have to figure out, is there something we can stop doing to support
Mhm.
some new initiative, because they always have those things. You can have a roadmap, and then chat gpt
Yeah.
shows up,
Yeah.
or you
Yeah.
have some part of the story that all of a sudden shows up because you need to get a product to market faster. And I understand all that, but then something has to come off the table.
Yeah.
um, I did I bet the GM at Cisco a case of beer that we wouldn't have enough capacity to do all the things that he wanted to do. Um, and it ended up being this great meme where he's like, "I want my case of beer." So like, like, work it out, product design and engineering, like, let's get the capacity constraint set up. So
That's funny. Um, Well, I guess I have one more question for
yeah.
you, which is, what would any like tips you would give to someone who is currently um, either not in a leadership position, but wants to be, or are early stages? Like, what's something you would suggest that might save them some heartache?
Well, I think it's important for people to recognize the difference between being a manager and being a leader. Uh,
Mm,
and they're different. And you can be a leader without managing people. Um, you can be a manager and not a leader.
mhm.
Um, and so, I think,
Explain that. I have
so
my own.
leadership is about influence. And
Mhm.
so that, there are ICs and organizations, individual contributors who have enormous influence, and I would say they're leaders. And organizations to recognize them. And in fact, you should have a performance track that allows someone to be an IC at a director level or even a VP level if the organization's large enough, if their impact is high enough, and that they can pull the organization in a certain way based on the way they work, the way
Mhm.
that they collaborate, the way that they organize people towards an outcome. um, Leadership's about setting the conditions for people to be successful, setting a vision of where you're trying to head, keeping people accountable to it, and delivering results. Managing is about uh, you know growth. How are you? Performance reviews, maybe telling people what to do. That's important, and you need that. But leadership is much more about the you know driving impact and bringing people with you along on that journey. And so, the advice I give someone early career is, when you have that first role, the first thing to master is the management level. You do need to master that because you need to know how to do that. You'd be surprised how many leaders and organizations never master that activity and are terrible at it their whole career.
Mhm.
But then you need to focus on, learning how to communicate effectively, to your team towards a goal. And then, how do you take them on that journey? How do you make them feel, like they've accomplished something? How do you, what are the rituals that you create to celebrate along the way? How do you make tough decisions and be explicit about them? And sometimes, and start to recognize that, leadership roles aren't always meaning that you're best friends with everybody in the organization, because sometimes you have to make choices that are hard.
Mhm. Well, so my takeaway from that is one, get clear with yourself about whether it's management or leadership or both that you want.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if you do want to manage people, get good at both.
Yes.
Managing and leading.
Be great at both. That's right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for having this conversation. It's just really delightful to learn more about you and extract some of the wisdom from your journey. And I appreciate that you shared that with all of the rest of us.
Oh, thanks, Teresa, for having me today. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. And for those of you who are listening into this conversation, if you are interested in hearing more interviews with other really interesting people, you can find those on my website at teresabrazen.com. Thank you so much, Greg.